sending in a request to vote absentee ballot, but you're not doing it in person, you need to send a photocopy of one of the photo identification IDs that are accepted by law as if you're voting in person, which would be a driver's license or passport or something similar to that. There is no physical impact from the legislation. The recommendation of the subcommittee is to report it.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to point out that there's no, when the registrar gets this picture on their application, there's no national registry of pictures to compare it to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. All right. With that, you can't vote electronic.
House Bill 1650 has a substitute.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The substitute would provide compensation for wrongful incarceration to Keith Allen Harwood, who spent 33 years in jail after being convicted of rape and murder, and he has received a writ of actual innocence after DNA evidence has tied another person who was also raped. They were both in the Navy on the same ship to the crime, and the other individual died in prison in Ohio. The formula would call for $1.55 million in relief, and the $209,000 up front, and $1.2 million in a annuity. And the recommendation of the subcommittee is to report the substitute.
All in favor, please cast your vote. Substitute reports.
The next three on the agenda were in Tony's area, but we were going to skip and have me do the last one, HB 2436. So that we don't come back and forth. This is Delegate Davis. This is related to Commonwealth Data Point. There is a line amendment.
Move the amendment. Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
What this does is APA maintains a website called Data Point that includes financial information. Right now, the code requires it to provide financial information on major agencies, which there is no definition in the code of what a major agency is. So essentially what this does is provide information for all agencies, which they already do, and including independent agencies, which it already does. It also requires them to create a new database that will list contact names for each agency for anybody who has any questions.
Looking forward to it.
We have a second?
Second.
All those wishing to cast their votes, please do so electronically. Clerk will close the roll. Substitute reports. Amendment. Tony, if I can get you for 1 second, please, and on House Bill 2244, substitute.
Move substitute. Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
And if you would like please to take the term, I wish to make a comment.
I'll briefly do a summary and then hand it over to the Secretary for his comments. The Chairman's House Bill 2244, the appropriation substitute, seeks to build upon the 2015 legislation that reformed the P3 process to both increase leverage for the public sector and ensure that P3s are used only when they're in the best interest of the public. The first section of the bill, 33-1801, the main change there is on lines 28 and 32. Instead of a project simply being in the interest of the public, it will have to be in the best interest of the public. Second section, 33-1803, relating to the approval by the responsible public entity. The major change is on lines 88 to 91. Private sector requests an upfront public contribution that is less than the amount needed to publicly finance improvements would be a requirement for approval of any project going forward. There's similar language in subsection D of that section down on lines 117 and lines 122 and 23 that requires that the contribution requested by the private entity is less than the amount needed to publicly finance the improvements. This is a new addition to the code. In terms of the finding of public interest in sections 1803.1, in the first subsection, it modifies the timing of the issuance of the finding of public interest. so that it would be prior to the meeting of the P3 Steering Committee. This is on lines 165 and 166. It also requires the Secretary to concur with the responsible and public entity, in this case VDOT or DRPT, in that finding. In subsection B, there are two new requirements: a description of the benefits expected to be delivered by the project, and analysis of the public contribution necessary to publicly finance it. The next section of the bill is a new section, 1803.1:1. This is one of the biggest changes being proposed. It's on lines 198 through 222. It adds a new section that requires that as part of the consideration of any P3 project at VDOT or DRPT, that they must ensure competition throughout the process by maintaining a public sector option against which to measure the private proposals. That's on lines 199 to 203. It would require the Secretary of Finance to work in the development of the financing assumptions of the public option, and include requirements that such analysis specifically address any mitigation of risk related to either competing facilities charges or a compensation for high HOV usage, which have been some concerns in some previously signed P3s. That's on lines 209 to 211. It would also require the responsible public entity to decide in advance whether the project is intended to be a design, build, or concession type arrangement, to level the playing field and ensure that the cost and risk are properly assessed for the specific type of project. Section 803.2, beginning on lines 223, adds some additional meetings of the Transportation Public-Private Steering Committee. It does not make any change to the board membership, but it does establish a series of meetings for the committee. First, it would meet prior to the initiation of any procurement under the PPTA to review just the public sector option and analyze and make their opinion that it was fully and reasonably developed, and evaluate the assumptions, especially with regards to the transfer of risk mitigation, and review the proposed term sheets. It changes the second meeting of the committee timing to require that they meet after receipt of the request for qualifications, but prior to the issuance of any draft RFP, to determine, based on the initial responses, that they concur that it is in the best interest of the public. Amend some of the public meeting requirements to allow the group to go into closed session to review proprietary information. This is all under current FOIA exemptions. This is listed out on lines 254 to 258. And finally, it would call for a final meeting of the committee that would also be in closed session to review for informational purposes the final bids received and the details of the evaluation done by the departments. Lastly, that makes changes to the interim agreement provisions of the PPTA to allow for the continued use of those, but only in instances where they're not being used for a vehicle for competitive negotiations with a single party, where the terms could be changed after you're down to the final entity.
Yeah, I believe.
I have a question about the bill, but I'll ask Gabe. Ian, I understood everything, and I think this is a good reform. Challenge that we've had in the past. I want to thank the chairman for bringing it forward. But look through, and you mentioned this, talk about being in the best interest of the public, which I think is a good measure. But do we define what best interest is? I was trying to read through this very quickly. I was trying to track back to where that may be defined, or how we use that term based on other code sections.
I'm not sure it is directly addressed, but it is addressed in the sense that any finding of public interest would require that it be in the long-range plan, and also that the project that moves forward is the cheapest option available, that you can't move to a P3 if the private entity cannot beat the cost of the public option that has been developed. So you have both the need for the project on the one hand, as evidenced by the existence in the long-range plan, and then the flip side of the equation is making sure you're getting your best bang for the taxpayer's dollar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, to add to that, that's exactly right for best interest in this situation. And that's why making sure a good public option which is fair and reasonable and can be achieved, is key to the negotiations, both for the state but also the private parties. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your willingness to patron this bill and working with you as we've done in the past. Thank you very much. This is basically, ladies and gentlemen, just putting into actual law the steps that we went through in the successful negotiation on Interstate 66. That's the basis for it. We have worked with the private parties, and we want to make sure we address any of their concerns. First of all, we want to make sure the public option is a real public option, just not something for them to shoot at, and that's why the additional step for the advisory committee, making sure this actually can be delivered. Also, it's incumbent upon the state to determine the project so that when the third parties or the private parties are being considered, they know what exactly the target is. They're not spending money that can be used against them, but also lets them know that if it's a fair competition and they know exactly up front what they're dealing with. And I don't know how, as a secretary, now that we have to sign off this certification, we can do that without having a fair competition with the public and private parties both being a part to it. I would say in 66 that the private parties substantially beat our public option, and I would think that would probably be I can't guarantee, but a case, I won't say substantially, but in the future, because they're able to take risks and do things that the Commonwealth should not do, quite frankly, in terms of how we view projects. So what we're really talking about is not building the project, is how we're going to finance it. And we have to make sure if we're going to bring private financing that it is compared to how we could do it, just to make sure that we don't put in some of the terms that, quite frankly, have been negotiated in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In relation to Delegate Landis's question, I think if you go to the substitute on lines 28 and 29, it defines when the public interest in a public-private partnership may be in the best interest of the public only when certain requirements are met, and those are enumerated 1 through 5. And I think in a nutshell, this is to encourage a private investment only when it's in the best interest of the public. So, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Secretary, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, let's go to Speaker Force. Second, all in favor, please cast your vote. All right, clerk will close the roll. Substitute reports 18-0. Tony?
Mr. Chairman, first bill is on the capital outlays, House Bill 2248. This is the Chairman's capital outlay plan bill. There is a substitute that the subcommittee adopted before you.
Motion second, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, substitute reports.
There is no fiscal impact. The substitute simply makes changes to the introduced version by removing some projects that had already been acted upon by the General Assembly in last year's bond bill, and adding some projects that were other high priority projects identified by the agencies. The subcommittee recommended reporting these substitute.
All in favor, please cast your vote. All right, the clerk will close the roll. Substitute reports 19-0.
Next bill is House Bill 2249. This is a technical bill. Virginia State University has 2 capital outlay projects, 9C projects, where the bill simply modifies the title of the project so that they can get access to the excess proceeds from 2 previous bond issuances and use them to do additional dorm renovations. The subcommittee recommended it, reporting 7-0.
Motion second, all in favor, please cast your vote. Clerk will close the roll. Bill reports 19-0. Tony?
Last bill, Mr. Chairman, is the Chairman's House Bill 2250. This is the annual 9C bond bill. It has 1 project for $13.6 million, a dorm project at William & Mary. The governor certified that the revenue stream from the project satisfies the payment to debt service. There's no general fund fiscal impact. There's no impact on debt capacity. And the subcommittee reported the bill.
Second. Have a motion second, all in favor, please cast your vote. Clerk will
Subcommittee on Compensation and Retirement, there's one bill, House Bill 1768, which has a substitute.
Move to substitute. Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, substitute reports.
Okay, House Bill 1768 by Delegate, taken by Delegate Garrett is a transparency bill. It's a recommendation of the Commission on Employee Retirement Security and Pension Reform. And what it deals with is some reporting transparency requirements for VRS. It requires them to report on a quarterly basis on 1, 3, 5, and 10-year investment performance data, annually on 20 and 25-year return investment performance data. It requires them to report net investment returns on a quarterly basis and gross returns on an annual basis. And they're already doing much of this work, but this just codifies the transparency to ensure it continues to happen.
Second.
A motion and a second on the substitute. All in favor, please cast your vote. Sorry. All right, clerk will close the roll. Report 19-0. Susan,
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I've got House Bill 1467 from the HR Subcommittee. This is Delegate Greason's bill essentially for the Board of Health to add one additional disease on the list of diseases that's required to be reported. This adds neonatal abstinence syndrome. That's for addicted babies. There's a small fiscal impact related to some web-based portal modifications and server support that they have to do. The subcommittee had recommended reporting 7-0.
have a motion and a second. All in favor, please cast your vote. Clerk will close the roll. Report 19-0.
The next bill is House Bill 1568. This is Delegate Orrock's bill. This is the National Criminal Background Check bill that captures most of the child daycare providers that are required through federal statute. And there were HWI amendments which added 2 enactment clauses. We didn't discuss those in subcommittee. I just wanted to point out your attention to it. Enactment clause number 4 would sunset the bill July 1, 2018. And then enactment number 5 would require the provisions of the bill to sunset if there were some changes in that the feds repealed some of the provisions that affect this bill prior to that time period. So there are 2 components to the fiscal impact. There's one on DSS for their background check activities that you appropriated funding for last year. So that's already in Chapter 780. There's an additional impact in state police. I think it's 4 positions. That's included in House Bill 1500, and you see at the it's about $329,000 and some change.
Have a motion to move the report. Second. All in favor, please cast your vote. Figuring this out, I guess. It went dark. What happened?
Sorry, did I miss you? Really?
Don't worry. I'll tell an excuse, don't worry. The bill as amended reports.
I got it.
Got it. Susan, please.
Okay, the last bill is House Bill 2317. This is Delegate O'Bannon's bill. This authorizes the Commissioner of Health to establish and operate a comprehensive harm reduction program during a declared public health emergency, which includes the provision of sterile and disposal of hypodermic needles and syringes. It's going to be located in specified at-risk communities in accordance with some criteria set forth by the Department of Health, and it does require the Department of Health to submit a progress report, October 1, 2018, and then a final report evaluating the effectiveness of the program. And it's not a statewide program. And the fiscal impact, the Department of Health is indicating that they can absorb it through federal and private funds and for some reallocating of resources within the central office and the local health departments.
Move to report.
We have a motion and a second. Cast your vote. The clerk will close the roll. Bill report 19-1.
Delegate Gilbert. There was a subcommittee substitute.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, substitute carried.
Okay, the bill would establish the Virginia Firearms Safety and Training for Sexual and Domestic Violence Victims Fund. What this fund would do is reimburse certified instructors that provide free firearm safety training to victims of domestic violence, sexual abuse, stalking, and family abuse. The committee substitute added language restricting the total reimbursements in any given fiscal year to the prior year balance and any new appropriations or fund balances. And it stipulates that the grants would be paid on a first-come, first-served basis.
All in favor? Please cast your vote.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to understand this. Is this the bill that gives a concealed carry permit to someone who has been a victim?
Sure. Pardon me?
Is this a concealed carry bill? Or is this just a pure training bill?
This is reimbursing for the training for concealed weapons.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to stay in office. Thank you.
Next up is House Bill 2206 from Delegate Cox. The bill is not anticipated to have a fiscal impact. What the bill does is provide the code sections for the Virginia Veteran and Family Support Program, which was formerly known as the Virginia Wounded Warrior Program. These changes are related to recommendations that came out of the VBFS working group that we established last session, which we set up to look at some of the issues that were identified in last year's JLARC study of DBS.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, please cast your vote. All right, close roll.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. There are two bills from the Commerce, Agricultural, Natural Resources, and Technology Subcommittee. The first is House Bill 1691, relating to a property conveyance, which would authorize DCR to convey a small piece of property in Stafford County to a subdivision. It has no fiscal impact, and the subcommittee recommended reporting the bill.
Motion and second. All in favor, please cast your vote.
Second, you have House Bill 2347. There is an appropriation substitute.
Second.
Second.
All in favor? All in favor, say aye. Opposed?
This legislation relates to the Commonwealth Opportunity Fund, and it was intended to change language related to the use of economic development funds involving a business that relocates or expands its operations in one or more Virginia localities while simultaneously closing its operations or greatly reducing the number of employees in another. The substitute before you would stipulate that the Secretary of Commerce and Trade can waive the provision that monies not be used for such a project only if the project is first reviewed by the MEI Commission, which, as you know, already reviews any number of economic development incentive packages.
Move to report substitute.
I would just say,